It is so great to have you here with us. First of all, how are you doing, and what's your world been like the last 6 or 7 months?
Carol, first, please call me Stan, and we're doing great. It's been very different. We suddenly stopped traveling so much, and as you and I talked a little while ago, my 3 granddaughters live next door to me, so I get this amazing amount of time with my family. And so it's been a reflective period of life, which isn't all bad.
No, exactly. Like, for a moment, if you can, you know, not think too much about the hardship, right, and certainly the impact of the pandemic, but it really has made us all stop and think about kind of how we've been living our lives and the processes. And I think about that for companies in particular, that I think it's been a moment to kind of reassess how we do things, how we run companies, how employees work, how we lead at our companies. But I do want to ask you, because I think what's been interesting about this time, and we've seen this with our breakaway members here at Bloomberg, is that some companies have actually done very, very well. We know, the headlines about Netflix, and because everybody was streaming. And then there are some companies that have just had a really difficult time because of the pandemic. It's not just one story that's out there. So I do wonder, as leaders, do we kind of throw out all the lessons and all the rules and all the playbooks that we've been following for decades because of the past 6 or 7 months?
I don't think we do, Carol. I think the first thing is soldiers always analogize things to war. When the conditions change dramatically, you adapt to those or you pay. Now, there are certain businesses that almost automatically did well in a pandemic. If you sold disposable, sterile wipes, things like that, you were going to do well, certain kinds of food and things like that. But the reality is the broad breadth of our businesses have got to operate well. And I think that there's a tendency to say we sent much of our workforce home, not all of it, because essential workers couldn't. But then when we got home and we opened our laptops and we were able to connect, there was this big sigh of relief that says, aha, this is not so hard. We can do it. And for a while, we executed. But what I would argue is we were operating on muscle we built up before, on capabilities we'd established through times before when we were interacting and operating differently. And so I think to assume that this was an automatic 180-degree turn and the new normal is going to be dramatically different isn't paying attention to all the signals. It's part of them.
So it sounds like you think a lot of the changes that are happening now, and I think about leaders, because it's interesting, we're hearing from certainly the last week or so, the big bank CEOs about, wanting to get workers back, or some thinking that, this is the way it's going to be. We're going to have a lot of workers working from home. I do wonder, we're getting different messaging out about kind of what the way forward is. And we've also got, we're dealing with leadership where there's mixed messaging or there's outright falsehoods that are put out there. How do you lead in that environment?
I think first admit what you do not know. I think you have to be very honest with your team and say, here's our situation in the marketplace. Here's our situation financially. Here is the strategy as we have adapted it to the current conditions. And then if you're not 100% sure if that strategy is going to be the right one or will have to be adapted more, tell the team, because they will know that intuitively anyway, or they will assume that. And so be very honest with the team that you're going to have to iterate the organization to what works. I would argue most organizations don't know what's going to work even 2 years from now, right now, because there are a number of factors driving it. One, we don't know if you make the decision to get rid of your offices, work entirely from home, we don't know what the dynamics of interpersonal relationships over time will be as you forget the times when you were together around the coffee pot. We don't know about leader development. We don't know how the market will change, how our competitors will adapt. So assuming that there is a new normal, this is it, and we're going to lock it down and move forward to greatness, I think is not paying attention to the fact we are on stormy seas with heavy winds, and it's going to keep pushing us in multiple directions. And what we have to do is be very cognizant of what's happening and continue to adjust.
Stan, I thought what you just said about competitors, like you don't know what your competitors are doing, because I do think Wall Street has watched this very, very closely when they were either bringing traders back versus those who weren't, right? Like a fraction of a second can mean a difference in terms of a profit on Wall Street. So I do wonder, as you said, we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but will there be, do you think companies that essentially have more workers back at work in a physical, setting, a physical corporate setting, will have an advantage over those that are letting workers stay at home? Or do we not know that yet? Which will be better?
Yeah. I think there'll be an argument both ways. My personal view is those that bring workers back are going to have an advantage. If we think about what builds trust, trust is built through interaction with people over time, and it's many things. You trust someone that you see a lot, you watch their behaviors, you know their intentions. It's harder to build up trust through a virtual medium or someone that you don't deal with very often. And trust cuts down transaction costs, so it makes you better. What do we do in most organizations? We do team building events. And having said that, I think that organizations that say, okay, everybody's going to come back the way it was in 1953, and we're going to avoid technology, are making a big mistake too, because I think we're going to have this hybrid where we do certain things much more efficiently, like cutting down travel, a lot of which is pretty inefficient, and doing virtual things. But I think the people that you've got to be bonded with, you're going to have a face-to-face interaction with pretty frequently to make that as powerful as we hope it'll be.
I want to come back to technology because I remember our last conversation last year, and I want to come back to that. But I want to ask you, speaking of teams, I mean, how are you advising your clients right now? Your clients are well-known brands, well-known, companies to our Breakaway members. I'm curious, how are you making sure, or they are making sure that their teams are inclusive, cohesive, and productive in this environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing is we don't have much choice right now because it's really impractical to bring teams together. So you adapt to the current environment, which means you have to be more intentional. What I tell people is we need to communicate better than ever before. A lot of our communications was always nonverbal, how you carried yourself, how you reacted to things. And there were also meetings before meetings as you stood in the hallway or around the table before the meeting started, or in the hallway after. That's not happening now. So we've got to be more intentional about communicating our priorities, making sure that the information we put out is clear and as complete as we know. But we also have to be intentional about being inclusive and creating diversity, which means if you're virtual and you want to just get together with the people you know a lot, you call them up and you interact, you've got to be more thoughtful. You've got to pull different parts of it together, which requires a little bit of planning. It takes a little bit more Outlook calendar management, in my view, so that you actually reach out to all the people and bring them onto the team. I argue it's harder now because it doesn't happen organically.
Well, it's interesting too, like diversity and inclusion, I think gosh, it's been upended this year. And it's not news stories, obviously, with what happened with George Floyd in Minneapolis and looking at the racism that's in this country. That's certainly one aspect and a very important aspect of it. But D&I, inclusion and diversity, sometimes that also now means things like the definition has broadened. It could be, the parent with young kids versus the single worker or employee who can work 24/7 around the clock. I mean, those are two different types of employees and their settings. Like, you really have to think about it differently, right, in terms of your teams.
You do. And the first thing you have to understand is that the United States of America is going to be competitive. We can't leave anybody on the bench. We don't have enough numbers and enough well-educated talent to leave anybody uneducated or anybody unused when we compete in the world marketplace. And then the idea of diversity, sometimes we confuse it with equality. We say diversity is a right. No, equality is a right. Diversity is right because it makes you more competitive. It makes you more effective. So diversity should be something that people lever, just like any of the other advantages that an organization can do to make sure all of its talent gets into the room. And that's just common sense.
So, you said about making sure that people, that if you were, at the office and you're in a meeting and you'd have a meeting before, a meeting in the conference room, and a meeting afterwards. And by that way, maybe you incorporate more people. So what do you have to do as leaders to make sure that you're reaching out to those workers that might be at home, where their home situation is maybe a little bit more full than some of your other workers?
Yeah, I mean, you think somebody at my age, I've got a house, I've got a home office, and I can do things, and it's fairly simple, except when my granddaughters run in and stick lollipops to my legs. But but what if I'm a young person and I'm not that sure of my position in the organization, and I'm working at the kitchen table, and my spouse has lost their job, and my kids aren't in school because it's closed, and suddenly it's not that easy. And so I'm trying to communicate, but I'm worried about a lot of things. And I also don't have the same network when I'm younger that people do older. And so I don't have a peer to watch to learn my job. I can't look two cubicles over and see how somebody else handles something and then learn how to do it. I can't be sure my boss thinks I'm doing a good job because I can't see him smile at me or give me a wink or a thumbs up. And it's uncomfortable for me to call my boss and go, how am I doing? So we as superiors have got to replace that. We've got to figure out first at the peer level how to get people networking so that they get the kind of support they need. But also from superiors at every level, not just the top, we've got to reach out and have conversations, not broadcasts, not motivational, big brother broadcasts, but something that says, how are you doing? Because remember in the office, you could always look at an employee and you sense how they're doing by their body language and what's in their eyes. It's harder virtually. And so you've got to pull it out a little bit. And this is what I talk about intentionality. It takes more effort.
Well, so how would you advise companies to do this kind of inclusivity work at scale? I mean, are you seeing any kind of policy innovation from companies that institutionalize the things that you're talking about right here?
Carol, I think everybody's exploring with it. I'm seeing, virtual happy hours. I'm seeing all hands. I'm seeing all combinations. I think there's a number of things. In our organization, we ask every member of our team, we're only 75, to call two other members of the team every day, and not their two big buds. Call two people they don't know as well, just for a 2-minute conversation video, just to build the connectivity. We also have a call every morning with the entire firm, video, so people can all talk and exchange, but there's still the quiet ones on the edges. And so you've got to reach out constantly.
What do you think are kind of the blind spots for leaders right now, Stan? Is it this about, those workers who maybe you're not meeting with, or what do you see right now? Because you're talking to a lot of your clients, and I'm curious what they're telling you or what you're seeing.
Yeah, I think the blind spots are what they don't see, because we don't know how well the team's performing. Your first response is, of course we do. Our stock price is higher, or our revenue's good, or some other KPI is solid. But we actually don't know who's doing the work. The work is getting done, but when you go around the floor, you're not sure who's working hard or who's working effectively or who's suffering, which makes it really hard to tune your organization, to motivate the people who need it, to adjust it. And I sense that leaders in organizations don't really know how their organizations work anymore. I mean, that's funny that I would say that, but for years now, we've been working with companies, and we find they have an org chart. We go in and we do this analysis, and we say, your organization doesn't function like you think it does, not like this. And they look at it and they go, that's right. Nowadays, it functions differently again, and they're not quite sure. There are certain things that seem to be doing well, but it's never functioned in this way before. So when they were younger, they never experienced it, so they can't draw on that kind of a background. So I think that organizations are sort of holding on, and I don't want to be real negative here, sort of holding on thinking, wow, I hope it's running okay, but I'm not entirely sure.
That's a really good point. I want to go back to, I know we've talked about already working from home. Do you think ultimately we're going to look back at this at 5 years and say this was a big change in terms of how workers were able to work? And I think about Silicon Valley saying, all right, you guys want to work, from now on, for the rest of your career here, you want to work from home? That's fine. You can live anywhere you want in the country. Are we going to look back, or again, do you think it's still too early to tell?
Yeah, I think it's too early. Stan McChrystal's opinion, and maybe I'm an old guy, no. One, I think people want to be with other people. They work in certain firms because they want the relationships. My years in the military weren't about what we did. It was about being part of that team. It was being shoulder to shoulder with people you trusted. I wanted to get up in the morning and put my grown-up clothes on and go to work and do that, and then come home at night, put on other clothes and be with my wife and son. I think most people want that, and I think it's very good for our psyche to do different things, use different parts of our brain. So I think that the desire to be together is very important. Now, there's a tension there because some people want to live anywhere in the country they want to live, and they want to be long distance from their firm. But my sense is it's much harder being long distance from your firm to be a full contributor. You can be a contributor, but to contribute in quite the same way, because you're just not in all the conversations that occur. You're just not in all the interactions that happen. Some of the informal things that people add to firms when they're just in the hallway. Every firm's got several people probably who people go, well, they don't seem that good at their job, but we love having them on the team because we're better when they're around. And I think that part of the human part is very, very important. Now, again, I think we will leverage technology more to do things faster and better. But I think the essential draw of wanting to be part of a team, wanting to feel like you are shoulder to shoulder with people that you admire is very, very important.
Well, it's interesting, something you said at last year's Breakaway. You said video conferencing is far more effective than a phone call, which is far more effective than an email. So, I mean, at least in this environment, all those Zoom, conferences that we're doing or whatever platforms, they're okay. It's better than just a phone call or an email, for sure.
Yeah, there's a hierarchy. There is face-to-face, and then video, and then way down is phone calls. And then way below that are chats and things like that, in my opinion. Because so much of it, and I know me personally, I react a lot to the other person's reaction to me, what their demeanor's like, their facial expressions, and things like that. I'm much more comfortable that way. So I think video is the next best thing, and the better we can make video, higher and higher quality, will be very, very important as well. But I think it's got to be part of it. Think of the relationships that you are most effective virtually with. Those are people typically that you've had a personal relationship as well. Then you get on and you're just sort of renewing them, and you know them 360 degrees. And so when you see them just two-dimensionally, it's not that uncomfortable. When you don't, it's just harder. And so I would argue we're going to get better at using virtual. We are learning it, but it's not going to go all the way, in my opinion.
So when it comes to team building, because I know this is kind of the focus of our conversation, that you would encourage your leaders to encourage their teams to do even more of it, right? Especially in this environment, I would assume.
I would urge do a lot of it, particularly now, and of course, as much as you can. Do team building that you can virtually, and there's some different techniques, not just virtual happy hours, but there are also interactive exercises you can do. Those things are very, very valuable because you're trying to build up the sinew that gets you through all the tough times. You know, if you look at an organization that really struggles in crisis, it's because in the times of non-crisis, they just haven't built up the trust or the interaction or the habits that they need. And so those that have been through a lot, it's not hard. So I think you have to very carefully and deliberately try to build those.
Stan, what needs to be the messaging from a leader right now about diversity and inclusion? Because I do think, as we talked about earlier, everybody has different home situations right now, especially if you're working from home, and some are easier than others. And some are struggling, some are thriving. But I do wonder as a leader, because I've been having conversations with CEOs and others, or even employees at companies where they're like, okay, I hear from my manager, don't worry, do what you need to do. And then something comes out in written form as an email from the company that says, we'd really love to have you back. So again, going back to that mixed messaging, what do we need to do as leaders to make sure that our teams feel confident so that they can be ultimately productive for us?
Yeah, diversity and inclusion is getting diversity of thought and talent and capability. And now typically that means a broad range of demographics, sex and race and different things and experience. But ultimately, what you're trying to do is get different skills and perspectives and experiences into the room so that you make a holistic decision much better. The thing to remember about diversity is at some point in your life, diversity is going to be threatening to you. And you say, now, wait a minute, if I'm a minority or something that hasn't gotten a fair shake in the past, that's right. But someday you're going to get old and you're going to be the old person. And when people want to bring young people in, you're going to go, wow, you're diversifying at my expense. So the reality is diversity will always be a bit uncomfortable. And so the fact that we have got to create it has got to be something we have to talk about. You know, I spent much of my life in a career where homogeneous was what we sought. We wanted every soldier to look the same so we gave them the same uniform, same haircut, and that sort of thing. But then when we got into really difficult combat, we said that that was not right for the counterterrorist fight. We had to get a diverse set of capabilities together, and that was very uncomfortable and unsettling for us. That's going to be true in every organization. And so we need to put it on the table and talk about it. We need to tell people, yeah, we're going to have to do some affirmative action, regardless of what that means in your particular organization. We are going to push some people with less experience, less qualifications forward, because that's the only way to get the first jump to move some of this forward. And I think that we're making progress in the nation, but we're not making progress fast enough. And so that uncomfortable conversation needs to be, front and center.
Now, one of the things that you have said in the past is you said a commonality among really great leaders is that they're self-disciplined. So I'm thinking about in this environment, and we're worried about our companies and their performance. We're worried about our teams and how they're doing. And we're trying to grow our companies in what can be a very tough environment. What do you think leaders need to be most self-disciplined about? And what do you think their teams need to be kind of self-disciplined about as well?
Yeah. I still believe self-discipline is absolute core of it, because most of us know what a good leader should do. And most of us in our current profession know what a good leader in that profession must do, because we're followers of those leaders. And so we have a sense of them. So I think the first thing is leaders have got to be based on values. They've got to put themselves on a foundation of values that they believe in and that other people can believe in, and they need to stick to it. They can't have what we call a say-do gap. They can't say this and then do something differently. And how many times do we find cases of that? And it, of course, undercuts their credibility as leaders. The second is they have to be honest with people. They need to tell people the truth as they know it, which may mean, I don't know what's going on. I am confused. But they need to be honest. And that runs counter to the idea of the great woman or man leader who's supposed to have all the answers and been everywhere and done everything. So I think leaders have got to be those things, and then they've got to be as consistent as possible. But consistent doesn't mean the same every day. It means consistent with responding to the situation as the situation requires or is appropriate for it. Organizations, when we talk about self-discipline, I think have got to, again, identify what their values are and what their priorities are, how they're going to approach their objectives, and then they've got to stick to it. It is so easy to be in an organization, be rowing really hard, and then find out you're going in a direction completely different from what your values or your stated objectives were. It's because you just got a little off course and everybody's working hard, and then suddenly somebody goes, we're doing something we don't even intend to do. And I think that's hard in a big organization to maintain, and that's part of the leader's role.
Before we go, there's one thing I wanted to kind of end on. It's a last thought, because I think about when we think about our teams at work and keeping your team together, building those teams, it's also meant thinking about, certainly because of COVID, their physical well-being, their health, but it's also their mental well-being. And I feel like you are someone who understands this, personally, as well as with the troops that you have overseen, the importance of people being healthy physically, mentally, as leaders, and also as your teams. What would you tell leaders about that right now?
I would tell leaders first, if in my experience, when you put privates in a defensive position at night, if you put a private alone in a foxhole and they can't see people to their left and right, they will be terrified. And why wouldn't they be? Whether the enemy is coming or not, in their minds, the enemy is coming, along with hobgoblins and things like that. And you say, I've got to empathize the fact if I was 18 years old again and I was out in that hole and I didn't know what was going on, I would be terrified. And so you have to put yourself in this position and set things up with that in mind. Also remember that leaders, we get good at putting a sort of a shield around us. Most leaders I know, their kids all go to Ivy League schools, their marriage is perfect, their life is great. You get their Christmas card and letter every year, and you just go, how can they be so great? The whole family wears white. Even the dog is good looking. And that ain't my family. That ain't my life. I've had a couple of periods in my life when, as they say, I was lower than a snake's belly in a wagon rut. And those were times when externally I was very successful and maybe in a position that other people will envy. When you learn that things hurt, when people get hit, it leaves a mark. When people get disappointed, it hurts. When people get frightened at every part in their career and life, it's still. And if we can sort of break through the person's natural desire to hide that and empathize, and we don't have to nail in says, I know you're scared, I know you're this, that's not important. Just put yourself on the other side of the table and say, what would that person be feeling right about now? And if you can appreciate that, and you don't always have to sympathize, you don't even have to like the person, but if you can empathize enough to put yourself in that position, it often allows you to have a little bit different view, and I think a little healthier view.